Hello and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the people who are attending our webinar today. We do know that there are people from the Americas, from Europe and Asia who have registered for this webinar, and I welcome all of you to something that's very pivotal and very topical at this time. We have an esteemed group of panelists here to talk about a very important subject, which is supply chain warfare. And essentially, given where the world is at this time, where the economies of different countries are at this time, and the way the world is shaping up, there could not be a topic more important. So I would like to welcome all of you. This webinar is going to be recorded, so it will be available for all of you who are attending to review it again at our website, and for those who are unable to attend it as well, to review it at a later time. There's also a Q&A function where you can ask any questions and put your questions there. We will try to take it up as much as possible. So this webinar is being organized by TCC. I'm sure all of you know we are a trade capital corporation, is a company based in California, Silicon Valley, and our objective is to deliver capital efficient supply chains for all our global clients. We have a tech platform called One TCC. And at this juncture, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. So first, I'd like to welcome Congressman James Greenwood. Congressman James Greenwood right now is in Pennsylvania and is participating from there. He was formerly the U.S. Congressman from Pennsylvania and chaired the House Energy and Commerce Committee Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. He later became the CEO of BIO, representing biotech entities globally, and he's supporting TCC's initiatives in life sciences, pharmaceutical, and medical devices. He is very much an advocate for appropriate healthcare legislation and regulation and has spoken widely on this subject. Thank you for joining us, Jim.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I go to Scott Wine. Scott, it's a pleasure to have you on this panel. Of course, everyone knows of you. You have been the CEO of Case New Holland CNHI for a few years, and also Polaris, where you were the chairman and CEO. You know the industrial world much more than I think anybody that I have come across in my career. And not only have you operated complex manufacturing and supply chain operations and handled them globally, you are also a U.S. Naval Academy candidate as well. So I am really pleased to have you here. You also serve on the boards of Cargill, U.S. Bancorp, and also the Naval Academy Foundation. Your impeccable record on corporate governance and operational excellence is quite visible. I really thank you for joining us. And then I also go to Yossi Feinberg. He is local for us in the Silicon Valley, and also a great supporter as well as a mentor personally to me and many of our colleagues. He is the Adams Distinguished Professor of Management at Stanford, Distinguished Professor of Management and Professor of Economics, and he also leads the Stanford's Ignite program. His research is focused on strategic decision-making and economic interactions, which is what is going to be a subject matter that we will discuss today. So I do welcome you, and thank you for taking the time to join us, Yossi.
So it's good to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. As we launch ourselves into this discussion, we will try to take three tracks. The first track is about where is the world today? What do we see in the world of business, in the world of business practices, and then also at the national level? We would try to assess that through all the three panelists. Then we would go to what should the world be thinking about for the future, for the next 10 to 20 years? Where should we place our attention? What strategies should we be thinking about? And then a call to action, what perhaps might be the best things leaders might do. With that, Scott, since you have been the practitioner of supply chain and have actual hands-on experience, from your vantage point, can you talk about what are the biggest challenges that you have seen in your day-to-day life as a CEO? And what kept you awake? What kept you thinking? What were the most critical items that you had to deal with during this time?
Thanks, Sanjay, for having me on. I will tell you that it made me think back to 2020 and the pandemic. I think any of us that were in any kind of operational role, face an unprecedented supply chain challenge coming out of that. And I think what we've seen since then is just a continued stream of really challenging issues in the supply chain. It could be, the Houthis shutting down the Straits of Hormuz, the longshoremen strike that we recently experienced. And remember, the longshoremen strike is only temporarily, we bought time until January 15th, but that's a risk. And those are some of the unexpected things. And then the planful reshoring move that's going on is really whether it's shifting supply chain from China to Vietnam, or from Vietnam and China to Mexico. All of these things create risk in the supply chain. And I think it's elevating the importance of supply chain professionals in the C-suite, and really making it paramount that boards and leadership teams are putting more emphasis on how they manage that risk, the critical thinking required to anticipate those risks, and just put themselves in a position to better manage this than the competition. And that's the challenge. And I suspect it's going to be a more challenging world from a supply chain perspective over the next decade rather than less. Those that are investing now in supply chain towers and talent are really going to be the ones that are the most agile and able to get through this challenging time the best, I believe.
Well, thank you very much. I remember those days when you would, as a CEO, run companies, and I was of a much smaller entity than what you have run. And in my recollection, the first time you would run a monthly management meeting, the finance and the sales functions will be the first, perhaps taking a disproportionate amount of time. And then if things were not particularly stark, you would give the opportunities to staff functions and supply chain, perhaps got little time to talk about. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And if it isn't really relevant, I think, it is operationally fine. Let's move on to other topics. I suspect that has changed over the past few years.
Oh, it's dramatically changed, and for very good reason, because supply chain became the constraint to deliver products for your customers. And also with inflation, it became a huge contributor to your cost profile. So I think what we've seen is just the elevation of supply chain and its importance to businesses, to customers, and ultimately to investors.
Well, thank you for highlighting that. Any comments from you, Yossi or Jim, in that context?
I think Scott handled it pretty well.
Yeah, thank you. We can move on then to the next subject, which is, these shocks and stresses are not only for a business, which would be a manufacturing business like we are in industrials. And when you coach students and when you coach and mentor C-suite execs at Stanford through your executive programs, what does the current landscape look like to you? What are you telling the execs at this time, Yossi?
So I actually want to build on what Scott was describing, because I think there's a fundamentally super important message in what he's saying. And the way I interpret it, I connect it to actually your question, which is, what have we learned from a crisis, right? And we solve today's crisis, and we plan for yesterday's crisis. And Scott is telling us, no, the crisis in the future is going to look different. And there should be sort of a strategic approach to how do we think about the resilience of our organization. And if we look at this, there's sort of a fundamental economic forces that lead us to that. And I think Scott hinted at that as well, which is there's competitive pressure all the time. And where does the pressure go? Internally, it goes to being, more cost effective, reduce the slack. And that competitive pressure puts the firms that are actually succeeding to lower their costs and become more efficient at a higher risk for the unanticipated shocks, and especially on the supply chain side. So there's a natural cycle here, which actually exposes firms more and more. I think one of the biggest things that we see now, and I'm sure Jim will have a lot of insight on that, is trade risks, right? And the nature of trade risks is that they come fast. It doesn't take years for them. They go from 0 to 1, and they basically are a large scale impact, and that's the things that we see right now. So when we think about industries, the industries that, naturally are now in the headlines: semiconductors, pharma, defense, agriculture, mining, these are industries already fully aware because they're under a lot of pressure. But I would urge every company to think about the whole ecosystem, upstream and downstream from them, and ask themselves, do they face potential challenges? Are they under risk, right? Because the interconnectedness that we have from these efficiencies really creates ripple effects whenever there's, and we saw that in automotive industry, right? Just recently. So the domino effect could be huge, especially if you feel secure and if you feel that you're pretty efficient, it can hit you more dramatically.
That's a very interesting point you talk about, which actually interfaces supply chain with product life cycles, with value chain management, your ability to price your products, the ability to pass on inflationary or otherwise risk adjusted costs, and also looking at your gross margin and so on. So it's a very deeply interconnected subject. And it's also very volatile. So the ability to manage such volatility, etc., and still be able to retain customer confidence and your product preference with your business at large is almost requires a rethink. Is what I'm hearing from you, and I think that's of paramount importance. We do know that during the time of the COVID crisis previously, not everyone could pass their costs, and some businesses had to buckle up, and some survived, and some didn't. And I think the ability to therefore be able to envisage this is quite critical. Scott, I think you alluded to that. Any other points from your standpoint when you look at forecasting business profits and so on, or performance? This becomes a critical factor, isn't it?
It is, and I think there's so much inflation risk out there, and what we need to build better supply chains is one of those things that I think is going to actually be a little bit more costly. I mean, for so long we had sole source agreements, and that was the best way to go. And I think what we're finding is it's important to have a second source many times, and sometimes it's ultimately carrying buffer stock that you wouldn't otherwise carry, so you can make sure those products are available for your customers and your operations continue to flow. And I think there's a lot of things as we assess the way to manage risks. It's likely to add a little bit more cost to the supply chain, and ways we can offset that cost. And I think that's one of the beauties of what you're building at 1TCC is a way to do that. And ultimately, it's about how we deliver better supply chains at a better value, which is going to be more difficult going forward.
Thank you for highlighting that. Yes, I think now we can move our attention to what does the nation at large help us. What we're talking about: policies, governmental policies, strategies. Jim, you have been in the thick of this for several decades now. The pharmaceutical industry went through a lot of crises, and therefore national stockpiling, the security measures that we need, the protection that sometimes the governments need to enforce on protecting their industries. Semiconductors, for example, is something that's coming up as a very important national asset to be built and protected for every country, not only for the US, but for everyone who's dependent, especially in the South China Sea as the tensions rise. How do you think about the preparedness or the strategies from a national standpoint?
Well, it seems to me that there are several trends that are weaving together here. Starting with the pandemic, it was hadn't happened like that for 100 years, but I serve on the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense, and we're keenly aware of the fact that the next pandemic will probably not be 100 years from now, that they will become more frequent. And we also are quite aware of the fact that you could have a terrorist group create a synthetic virus, for instance, and create a pandemic in that way. The U.S.-China relationship, of course, is fraught. And not only in terms of the reliance that our companies and our country has on products that are made in China, but also the threat to Taiwan, of course, which has been leading in microchips. Then we have the first serious war in Europe with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And then you add to that the politics of America first, wanting to use protectionist methods and tariffs in order to keep jobs in the USA. So all of those things, and then also extreme environmental incidents, which can disrupt supply chain. So all of that's happening at the same time. And we see that President Biden has created what he calls his Supply Chain Resilience Council. We see Brexit, which was related to these kinds of issues, reliance on other countries. We see in Europe, they call it Europe self-sufficiency drive within the EU. So all of these things are happening at once, and navigating them in such a way that we preserve our security, and we nearshore and we friendshore, and we onshore supplies and production without at the same time raising prices, having prices go sky high while we're doing that. So all of these are the kinds of issues with which policymakers are now dealing.
It's interesting the kind of elements that a government, well, obviously in 2 weeks, there's going to be an interesting time. It's an intense and interesting time for the country here in the US. People who are in the Americas would know. But we've got lots of volatile, perhaps elements that could be subject to change. We've got the NATO, we've got the USMCA, there's the BRICS thing that is underway from geopolitical forces standpoint. The Asia Pacific corridor countries also have alliances. There are small boutique alliances that are coming up. There are friendly countries working together, and so on. Within that, then there is the oil, which obviously is another concern, and volatility from OPEC, and that sort of can hamper any economic agenda. We also see that the movement of manufacturers from China to Mexico, and some of those entities being owned by Chinese interests. So knowing your original source of interest, getting to know your investors and know your suppliers well, all of those things become very critical. We have got the CFIUS Act, which actually is now controlling investments in the US. The government has a lot on its plate, wouldn't you think? I mean, compared to, it always did, but from a business and economic standpoint, it's got a pretty full plate, I'd like to think.
It does, and I think the difficulty, of course, is you overlay partisan politics, and so it becomes difficult sometimes to deal with these kinds of issues in a rational way that isn't affected by politics. And whether, as I mentioned, whether that's involving tariffs, whether it's onshoring from places where we actually are friends and allies, where we don't need necessarily to be so concerned about supplies chain being disrupted for nefarious reasons. And so, yes, the plate is full. And it does require some very, very sober decisions about how we manage this in a way that makes sure that we have the security that we need that can be at risk for a lot of reasons, and still have the opportunity to participate in global trade in ways that are good for multiple countries. What we don't want to do is drive our allies away because in our desire to be so self-reliant, we stop relying on some of our friendly allies to deliver to us the kinds of things that they need to.
Thank you for highlighting that. If there was one expectation or aspiration from you, if you were in that scenario, what would you aspire or ask for 2 weeks from today?
Well, I think part of what the government needs to do is create incentives for self-reliance. because many manufacturers know that what they're involved in is they're acquiring supplies from places where they're made at less cost, because labor costs, among other things, are there. And so if the government expects manufacturers to become more self-reliant, to stockpile goods here, to manufacture goods here, it may require incentives, financial incentives from the government in terms of subsidies or tax breaks, in order to make it attractive to our manufacturers.
That's very well put. Thank you for highlighting that again, Jim. I think at this point in time, we will focus. We've seen, what the state of affairs is right now from a company standpoint, overall the industry and the government. And so now, in this light, Scott, if you were looking at business leaders and strategies that you would want to deploy, what would you recommend to your fellow CEOs or leadership teams or the boards that you're on about how they should prioritize their long-term or mid-term strategies? What should they thinking about? How can they build a playbook that will work towards a successful decade going forward?
I think one of the paramount issues is, how do you create supply chain resiliency? And that's we discussed earlier about just how hard that is. But boards are going to have to be willing to let companies make the investments to create some of that. And again, some of it's around technology and building this overview of your supply chain that you can manage extremely well. Some of it is just the investment. You talked about strategic alliance with investors, with suppliers that want to become, key partners with you in this journey. And, if you create those relationships, they can help you manage risk together. And I think, whether it's you think back, you and I grew up, Sanjay, with the Keiretsu example out of Japan was the way things all should be done. I don't think we can go that far, but I do think that we need to have better, more strategic relationships with suppliers. We're likely going to have multiple sources sometimes, just to alleviate the risk. But if we can get suppliers into the design process, a lot of times, and you've had history and experience in the chip industry, and a lot of times that integrated development becomes so important in what you can do. And I think, ultimately investing more in the talent, investing more in the systems, and then just keeping it an elevated priority in whether it's the operating reviews or the board meetings, just to make sure that we are adjusting as quickly as we can. I think the ability to be agile with supply chains is going to be incredibly and increasingly important in the years ahead.
Yes, I think those memories of working, I work for two family-owned companies, and obviously the mechanics of working with certain vendor relationships was a little bit different. Of course, this goes back to 2 decades ago. At the moment, I think thinking about suppliers as tactical suppliers that are meant for a quarter-to-quarter result process, I think that is something that perhaps might hurt us more than anything else. A strategic collaboration, as you said, partnership with suppliers, thinking about them as your business, yet diversifying them and putting supplies in different geopolitical locations, making sure that they are in the pathway of not a political risk or an economic risk or a otherwise country risk is important, but building that dual pronged strategy, I think that's very important. We've optimized costs so far, but it's not necessarily, if you just go along the line of optimizing costs, perhaps the other benefits have been lost and they come back to hurt in a much more vengeful way. I think, thank you for highlighting that.
Well, and Sanjay, don't forget, a lot of the things that we both just talked about, whether it's, setting up a second supply source or nearshoring things, all of these elements might be the right moves, but they also enhance short-term risk in the supply chain. So, as we work through this, no matter how you look at it, it's going to require more attention and more focus on how well we manage through supply chains over the next 5 and 10 years. It's going to be challenging, but I think the companies that do it best are going to come out ahead.
Yes, and that's the thing that TCC is focused on is to figuring out buffers. Inventories end up making supply chains bulky. Supply chains become unwieldy with a lot of capital stuck. We're trying to make sure that they are nimble and agile. That's our vision, and hopefully that'll help make supply chains more agile and maneuverable. Because the last thing you really want in a supply chain is something that's welded, that is stuck to a point, and that particular lever is inflexible. And I think flexibility can only be taken when many of these elements are democratized and put into different places where they are maneuverable and easy. So,
And Sanjay, if I can speak specifically to the pharmaceutical industry a bit, if we're going to the extent that we're going to still rely on our friendly allies for pharmaceutical products, and one of the things we have to do is harmonize regulations more than it's been a challenge forever for 20 some years or longer to try to harmonize regulations, so that if we need to import or continue to import from Switzerland or other countries in Europe, we need to be able to be sure that the golden standard of safety and efficacy, that is the FDA, is applied elsewhere, and so we don't have to question whether the pharmaceutical products we're importing are in fact safe and effective. And so that means things like I've been in facilities in Europe where the management will say, first the FDA comes over and inspects us, then Japan comes over and inspects us, and then this country comes over and inspects us. And it's redundant and it's unnecessary. But if we had harmonized standards, any one of those visits by the inspections would suffice. And similarly, we need to be able to make sure that we can move products through the regulatory process quickly when needed, and that we also can use artificial intelligence and big data sets to anticipate when we may have drug shortages in this country that is going to require us to go elsewhere, or shortages in other countries that are going to have to give us the opportunity or force upon us the opportunity to manufacture those products here in the US that we've been used to importing.
thank you for saying that. That brings about an important item which I hadn't thought about, which is a new supply chain network that is not only uniform, harmonious, but it's also very dependable, reliable, predictable, and collaborative. So that companies, it doesn't always have to be you thinking about different nations and different entities, but you can create your supply chain network that can later on become standardized for industry sets or sectors. But create dependency that way and reliability that way. I think we haven't gone that far to creating those networks, and there is lots of dissimilarities and I think fractions and agendas that may need to be unified. And perhaps all the turbulence that's underway right now might force us to think about healthier supply chain networks as an entirety to build out more resiliency. Thank you very much, Jim, on that. I'd like to move to AI. And, AI is a word that's actually, we come from the Silicon Valley. Sometimes it seems like cliche, but at the moment, I use it a lot. My colleagues have changed my name from Sanjay to Sanjai in all humor, because I have been a ardent user. I'd recommend everybody to toy with it. Not that it's always 100% accurate, but you'll get there. That's my hope. Yossi, you are at Stanford University, not only where the technologies are developed, but you also coach businesses on how to use them and what should be our future strategy. How do you think about this in the context of supply chain, autonomous supply chains and other supply chain technologies?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. I mean, first of all, it's super tempting to maybe go into a debate with Jim here about the role of government, and balancing, various things that the government can do, right? I'm not a big fan of subsidies, but I think intervening with countries that create unfair advantages for companies that compete with US companies is one of the major things that governments can do. And what Jim said about standardizing across borders in a global market is just fantastic. I mean, any progress on that would be hugely useful. And when I look at it, that's going to be on the AI side and on startup side as well, because I think different impacts on society can happen. And I'm actually mostly concerned about the impact on the labor force. I think this technology is particularly aimed to do what we people do and better. So I think this is where I would look at it. In the context of a supply chain, I would look at it at in the context of a value chain, right? And if you're thinking about anything that your company is involved with, from end to end, there'll be changes impacted by AI. AI is going to impact basically upstream, downstream, how people communicate, how people make decisions, make purchasing decisions, how businesses operate. You're going to replace people with AI agents, and it's happening right now. It's not. It's accelerating productivity, but as it accelerates productivity, it reduces demand for labor in exactly those fields. And that's going to change. So I would say, in the spirit of what Scott said, thinking 5 and 10 years ahead and asking ourselves, how will the world look like with AI? And what does that mean for my industry and where I am in the value chain? And that's going to trickle down to all our decisions. I think a great example for that is, we saw it in the automotive industry. This industry had a long time, and still does, to prepare for self-driving. But self-driving also means ownership model changes, right? The ride-sharing platforms have created, a major change in that as well. So all that is coming. And even though you have a long time to prepare for it, you have to rethink strategically your whole business. And I think this is coming to almost every industry. It's going to have a huge impact. It's not only new products and services, it's also going to change how business is done, who you communicate with, the human component, your organization model. So that to me is dramatic. And on top of that, we have the risk that Jim talked about, which is, the scary stuff that with AI, people who are nefarious and really want to hurt us have stronger tools to execute really scary stuff. So I think it's exciting, but it should be worrying at the same time.
You brought a very interesting point about the entire end-to-end value chain. And I think this is where I think supply chain and value chains, we sometimes use them interchangeably, sometimes differently. Supply chain would be more thought about as an execution process and logistics execution process, but value chain is end-to-end. What do your customers' demand look like? What pricing mechanics work from all the way down there to sourcing strategies, manufacturing strategies, the embodiment of the entire value process.
And Sanjay, if I may, this is not related to AI, but it's what I consider to be a potential very long-range solution to a couple of problems. And this may sound crazy, and maybe it is crazy, but if you think about what we're faced with immigration and the difficulty we've had in trying to figure out what to do about that, and particularly from places like Central America, and the long-term thing that has to be done there is probably for places like Guatemala and Honduras and Ecuador to have economic growth so that people are not fleeing from poverty. And then you look at our over-reliance on supplies of all kinds of things from China, and how we become at risk because of that. Incentives for things that are made in China, as opposed to things that are manufactured in the U.S. now. Incentives for manufacturers to manufacture those things in places like Central America could, at the same time, reduce our reliance on a hostile country like China, and without taking American jobs away, because we're talking about products that are already made, not here, but made in China, that could solve a couple of problems at once. It could make for more economic self-reliance there and reduce our dependence on China at the same time.
That's a very beautiful, and I hope the audience got the context of it. You could solve an entire end-to-end value chain problem, also look at national economic security, and also look at regional security. And I think this is as far as an impact from a supply chain strategy can go. We had seen, thank you for bringing that up, Jim. We also had seen some disruptions in Bangladesh and also in Sri Lanka. You might have noticed that previously, where most of our textiles were being imported from. And I think the stability of smaller countries like those that are impoverished, where the GDPs are less, not only could be good candidates for economic growth, but also for resiliency and diversification of supply chain risk. I think that's a really interesting point. And perhaps there could be some mechanics through the national government mechanics to be able to support companies that end up wanting to sort of resort to and take benefit of such strategies. So I think really like that interplay. You already answered my question, which would have been directed to you about how can governments be better prepared for supply chain disruptions and support businesses. But you went ahead and not only talked about businesses, but how do you answer this whole question holistically and answer, and impact more than just businesses and individual governments. We've come to a point now where I think the leadership of companies and the boards, I think you highlighted that, Scott, need to start thinking differently. We've been thinking along the same way. And of course, if you are a business leader, you do want to look at your earnings and you generally need to know what your shareholders care for. Your capital does come from there, so you cannot be completely out of sync with those expectations. But within that, I think we have the ability to prioritize and make certain judicious decisions and trade-offs. This requires a different level of skill now, almost a statesman-like skill, where sometimes you have to be on the table with people you disagree for a long time and continue to meet them for a long time. It could be suppliers, it could be other supplier nations, it could be different country groups that we talked about. So what do you think, Scott, from your vantage point, should be the leadership characteristics for the next generation of leaders, or the current generation, people who are actually minding their companies and their boards, and the ones to follow for the next 10 years? What would you expect a leader to be like?
Well, I think we're going to have to require a higher intellect in our supply. A lot of supply chain people of years ago came up through the operational ranks and don't have necessarily that expertise in data management or using the AI tools for critical thinking that you talked about. And I think we're just going to have to invest more in the hiring process of not just supply chain leaders, but the entire talent pool within the supply chain, because it's going to be so important. Yossi talked about the importance of AI and how much generative AI is going to impact things over time. We all thought blockchain was probably going to be adopted at somewhat sooner. That's likely to come in with this. So, we're going to have so much change going on in supply chain, not just the physical change, but also the technological change. I think we all need to be prepared for that. And that can only happen if we just hire, better and smarter and more agile people into these roles.
Hey, Scott, can I ask you a question? So if you're making widgets, and those widgets are being made in Asia somewhere, and you've decided to do that because even when you add the shipping cost to bring it overseas, it's still a better deal. The price is lower and enables you to compete efficiently against other manufacturers with the same product that are also using low-cost labor.
We all did.
Right. Right. So now you're worried about supply chain. And now you're thinking about, well, maybe I need to have these important widgets or parts of widgets built in the USA. How do you see management balancing those two concerns?
I literally just did this when I was at CNH, and what we did is we insisted on having, if we were going to source something out of China or continue to source something out of China, we required there be an alternative source either in Europe or North America, just so we had that opportunity if something happened, whether it's a pandemic or geopolitical issues, that we could still have source of supply. So that's how we handled it. Is just we didn't say you have to get out of China. We just said if you're going to stay in China, you've got to have a second source.
So it's redundancy. It's redundancy in the supply chain.
Exactly.
Very good.
And interestingly, for a lot of years, not many years, we knew that we were actually getting into a single source country, not a single source supplier. I think we got the benefits of it, but it went so far as I think at some point in time, it has become counterintuitive and also a risk factor. So I think we hope not to do that again.
But many of us, don't forget, it was fool's gold, but thinking that not only were you getting cost savings, but you were getting access to that market. And I think that is where, and Jim knows this, that we ended up not getting what we thought we were getting as we moved more and more production to China. The market opportunity turned out not to be there for most of us.
On top of that, I think the concerns around intellectual property and forced tech transfers and things like that, the imbalance of payments obviously makes it. It was a composite of issues that actually caused trade. Should I say the stress that we face now, and I think it's a lesson well learned. But coming back to I think your question, Jim, about how would management and how would teams be balancing producing the country versus outsourcing. I think the supply chain leaderships of tomorrow may have to have qualities that understand geopolitics, qualities that understand supplier behavior, economics, taxes, for example. Logistics and 3PL partners become very important because how do you connect these two nodes? And therefore, the ownership and performance and reliability of those 3PL networks, the transportation networks, the warehousing and logistics people also needs to be carefully thought about. And there are M&A underway in that business as well. So being mindful of not being
And I think that, frankly, that's a role that one TCC can play because many manufacturers don't have the capacity to be thinking about, to gather intelligence to be able to anticipate potential disruptions in the supply chain, whereas we can and gather that information and share it with our clients so that they don't have to do it by themselves.
And thank you for highlighting that again, Jim. I think it's almost a change management process, a change of thought process, where you're thinking along a linear line now, and how do you change strategies? Which brings to a final question. I'd like to ask this to Yossi. Yossi, rethinking supply chains in the new economic paradigm, in the new geopolitical paradigm, requires a lot of change management. And that's the most difficult part. We can give a sermon to leadership team members, but trickling it down to real effective outcomes is hard. Do you see any strategies that have been successful? Any other words of wisdom from you on how we can manage supply chains in a different way and come to a different business model? Like we are establishing at TCC, how do you effect change management in companies that generally are slow to change?
So I'm actually going to build again on what Jim and Scott said, because I think they gave us the answer, and they gave us multiple answers. But I think this is the strategic answer, which is reassessing how my production function as a company. And looking at it not only in terms of optimizing efficiency, but creating those buffers and hedges against risk, right? And every part of the company does some of this, right? The production people may do some of it. I mean, obviously the finance people are doing some of it, but having that as part of your overall strategy and competitive strategy, going ahead and saying, here is, I'm going to diligently develop as part of my company's strategy as a leader in the company, a hedging and buffering and diversity structure, because the shocks are not going away. They're going to come faster, and it's going to come from many different directions. And we heard just some of them today. And then you get to answers like, what we heard from Jim and Scott, which is, okay, so you have redundancy in suppliers. You started with another country, or you have solutions like one TCC, which is you create a buffer, right, as a solution, but the buffer, as a low cost solution. So whatever it is, really diversifying against all these collection of risks that can happen. I'll give one small example. Scott talked about relational. That's costly, and it may or may not work in your industry, right? In some cases, relations do create commitment by the other side. When things are tough, they'll stay with you. In other cases, your supplier, it could be a shock not to you, it could be a shock to your competitor, but they come to your supplier, they're under pressure, they're giving them a sweet deal, and suddenly you have a problem, right? So like every solution that you're going to have, I really think it needs to be strategic, because it has to be a portfolio and not just a single solution. Otherwise, I don't think it's going to protect you.
This was a very vigorous debate and discussion. I wouldn't say it was a debate. We pulled and put the bricks together to build out a thought process here. Yossi, you've summed it all very well. I think there's vision and strategy at leadership levels that should take care of all of these disparate moving parts and bring it into one. It requires astute leadership, but multifaceted leadership. Jim, you brought about how we can work with different countries and create more alliances and take this as an opportunity to solve world hunger, perhaps, and also bring resiliency in supply chain, which was, I think, for me, the biggest takeaway today. And Scott, you talked about how our dependency on single source strategies, chasing yield curves, etc., perhaps needs to be revalued and re-examined in the light of the current construct where we've got two major conflicts underway. We've got the election and the political perhaps disruption that has been caused in different countries as well, and I think it's important for us to look at all of these holistically. So I do want to thank you everyone for your constructive comments. I think our audience got a lot from here, and I hope that you have all received the benefit of this collective wisdom. There are a few questions. I think there's one question. There's a very interesting one. The first one, I think, Jim, I might even direct that to you. It's from a hospital exec. It says Baxter manufactures 60% of all intravenous solutions in the US. Their North Carolina facility was severely impacted by hurricane recently.
I'm sorry, by what?
By a hurricane. And as a user of IV solutions at my hospital, I'm now canceling my non-essential service surgeries. How do I plan for anomalies like this?
Well, I wish I knew. It's a pretty specialized question. And I would think that maybe if I was a hospital administrator, then I might work through my trade association because there's a shared, they're all going to be facing the same problem. And working through the trade association, try to create incentives for so that there are multiple suppliers rather than just one. But that's the best answer I can give for now.
Yes, and I think also it reflects on inventory holding strategies. I think that's also important. Previously, I think we run very low on investments in inventory, and that's just because I think we do not have sufficient capital to be able to be deployed. And I think that's something that could be revisited. TCC does this for large corporations anyway, and I think this could be Andy. I think what happens in situations like this, when the buffer stocks don't suffice or are not sufficient to tide over and the lead times and the transportation times become unduly long and of course disrupted, it's very hard to rebuild that very quickly. So I think that's something to be thought about. I would look at inventory strategies.
And you know, the federal government does have stockpiles, strategic stockpiles of for all kinds of healthcare needs. And it may be that the federal government is going to have to expand the kinds of things that it includes in that stockpile for all of the reasons we've been discussing.
Yes, thank you again for highlighting that. This is an interesting question. I might pose this to Scott. How can global supply chains be structurally aligned to strategic alliances without excessive disruption in current supply chain practices? So if you were to maneuver that from a tactical to a strategic, how can we do that without disruption internally?
Well, I think it's really ensuring the continuation of supply. So you don't want to change something until you have something else aligned. So keeping, if you're bringing on another source, make sure you're not alienating the experience with the current source. Or if you're setting up a new distribution setup, don't change the one you have until you've got proof of concept or proof of performance of what you're doing. And I think that's the focus on. I think resiliency just has to take a higher proportion. A lot of times I think we would have taken risks previously with supply chain that we just can't afford to take anymore. And that really is the requirement, I think, is just to always make sure you've got, before you turn the switch on something new, make sure that you've got continuation of supply from your previous source.
So this is, I think we've come to towards the end of this webinar. We have one question I think that I might take up, which is about which companies you could think about as the gold standard for resiliency, and who are the leaders who think like this. I think this question I might take up. John Chambers from Cisco has been an ardent believer of global supply chains, and the way that Cisco's supply chain was managed has been, I would call it, I wouldn't know about gold standards, etc., but I would say that it's one of the ones that you would look to be at the top of the pack. I think Johnson & Johnson does a really good pack. There are more examples of how companies actually have failed than the ones at the top. Also, the ones at the highest performance are also not spared of turbulence, or nor are they spared of risk. So I think I would stay away from ranking and causing should I say, a metric around who is the best. This is a never-ending, continuous process that you always have to be on top of. And with that note, I would want to thank all our panelists. Thank you very much. You have been very busy yourself. So Scott, thank you very much for joining us and bringing your wisdom from the boardrooms and the CEO's desk to here. Jim, I know you are in Pennsylvania at a very important event. You took the time to come down, despite what you're engaged with, to spend this hour with us. Cannot appreciate it more. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And also, Yossi, is always invigorating to look at how you think beyond just the immediate business to get words of wisdom from you. So I do want to thank all of you. For the participants, again, I want to thank you for joining us from all the different time zones and continents. It's a Friday evening. Some of you might have had to be on this webinar at your dinner time. So I hope that was worth and you don't have any disruptions at home. I also want to let you know that there will be a survey that you will receive from our team. And if you can fill that out, that would be great for us to know how we performed here, and also to give us any inputs of what subjects and topics you would like us to take up. At TCC, we are dedicated towards building supply chain resiliency and driving capital efficient supply chains that make the hallmark of a good company and also a good country. We are also going to make this webinar available, the video, on onetcc.com. I also want to thank our astute team of TCC's exec members who helped organize this webinar, notably Rania and Alexander. Both of you, thank you very much for running a tight ship. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day. Bye-bye.